It's far and away my most sapphic story, which is why I couldn't resist calling the school Radcliffe Hall. It's no wonder I don't get asked to the old girls' reunions anymore.
Well, apart from portraying the place as heaving with sapphic scholars, I don't know how you expected them to react after you described them in print more than once as that strictly anonymous dump in Sussex. You have a very curious concept of what anonymity means.
No, come off it. The place has generated a few humorous headlines in its time. Miss Mellenby was our head of English. She later became head of postal. And then an inspector of HM prisons. And no one at the school could see why the rest of the world found it so funny.
Well, you've certainly made the most of being a Rodine rebel.
Well, the only way you could survive the place was by rebelling against it. Did you know, by the way, that the building was requisitioned by the Navy during the war for officer training? Just think, if things had taken a different turn, I could have ended up sleeping in my old dormitory. And some of the Wren's rules and regulations were just like being back at boarding school. Of course, the one thing the Wren's training quarters didn't have that Rodine had was that next to every bed there was a bell push with a sign that read, "Press the button if you need a mistress for any reason."
That must have been comforting for you all.
Oh, yes, you can imagine.
Yeah. I'm afraid the Wolverhampton Royal Orphanage was rather short on comfort. We got up at 6:30 a.m. and had a wash in cold water. All the boys were made to get into a big bath together, supervised by a maid. That was an eye-opener in more ways than one. When I asked my mother why my penis was different from that of the boy with whom I had been bathing, she told me about circumcision and what it meant.
Oh, well, that must have been quite an eye-opener for your mother as well.
Well, I was precociously frank. But I think being matron of the workhouse all those years had given her a fairly unblinkered view of the world. Although I doubt any of the unfortunate children in her charge were quite as frank as I was. Though I have been pleased to notice that there is a refreshing tendency among the children of today to be a little more frank in these matters. One doesn't need to talk about these things much, but when one must, one might as well call a fart a fart.
And then blame Baxi.
I beg your pardon.
At home, we have an imaginary creature called Baxi who lives in the fridge. And he's responsible for any repulsive noises that happen. So if anyone farts or belches while we're sitting at the table, we all turn round and blame Baxi. In fact, he's so popular, he's going to get his own cartoon strip in my next children's book, The Nancy Spain Beaver Annual. He's going to look like a cross between a seal and an amoeba, with smooth fur and flippers.
I fear future generations will be scarred for life. Perhaps there is something to be said for keeping children's blinkers on, after all.
Well, I would imagine they'll be kept on at Rodine ad infinitum. Girls led a very blinkered life in many respects. We were never allowed to go into Brighton, and the only man we ever saw was the gardener. Oh, apart from parents' days, of course. Then we might get treated to some rather glamorous male visitors. I'm sure I've told you that Gertrude Lawrence's daughter was one of my classmates.
Oh, I think you might have mentioned it in passing. About 100 times. To the entire world.
You know, sometimes when Gertrude came to visit, she was escorted by the likes of Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And I must say, she gave one of the best performances as a mother that I've ever seen. I suppose you could say it was Rodine that nurtured my love of celebrities, whether they be Hollywood royalty or real royalty.
Well, I've only really been impressed by one of the Windsors. I met the Queen Mother once when she opened a new wing at the hospice I'd done some fundraising for, and I was much impressed by how she'd found something to say to each and every one of the 75 patients she was introduced to.
Oh, it's not as impressive as you might think. Princess Margaret told me the trick. By the time she's got past the first 10, she just repeats what she said to them to the next 10 and so forth. And no one's the wiser.
Well, thank you for bursting my one and only royal balloon so effectively. I dare say the Hollywood royalty so beloved to you and your fellow pupils used similar tricks when they had you hanging on their every word.
You can't blame us for being impressed by Hollywood glamour. God knows there was little enough glamour the rest of the time. Our uniforms were these rather shapeless garments called Jibbers. And they did big girls no favours at all, I can tell you. But for all its faults, I grew healthy at Rodine. And I started to grow inwards as well as outwards. The private life of a schoolgirl is an extraordinary and secretive thing, you know. So I kept a sort of poetic diary. I called it To Please Myself.
And did it?
Oh, very much. All through my last spring term, I had the most painfully passionate crush on our French teacher. She was called Tyra Creek Clark. I think she began my lifelong love affair with all things French. After all, they say Paris is a woman, don't they?
Ah, well, that would explain why, unlike you, I've never completely fallen for Paris. But I think it must be a wonderful place in which to show off, so I'd say that you and she are a perfect match. Were your odes written in code?
Oh, good heavens, no. That would have been too much like hard work. But we did develop our own school slang, some of which was less than poetic. The toilet was known as aunt. Chocolate blancmange was muck or Thames mud, and for reasons I cannot recall, roly-poly pudding was known as boiled baby's arm.
Ah, that would have qualified as luxury food at the Royal Orphanage School. Twice a week for dinner we were given gobby, a kind of meat pudding which consisted of a soggy crust and a lump of rainbow-coloured fat. We found the oddest things in it, everything from bits of string to rats' tails. Try putting that in your cookbook. It's no wonder I never enjoyed rude hells, just a reputation for being rude.
I don't really regard you as rude. You're merely fearlessly forthright. You're the Dr. Johnson of your day. You just don't have a Boswell, that's all.
Nonsense. Johnson genuinely had a first-class mind, whereas it's a popular misconception that I have one. I have a reputation for being a man of immense knowledge. In fact, I am a man of modest knowledge who had what was an ordinary education, but which nowadays passes for an extraordinary education, because people have become increasingly ignorant. So apart from outspokenness, the only other thing I've got in common with Johnson is that we're both cat lovers.
I beg to differ. Boswell once said of Johnson that his great knowledge and strength of expression command vast respect and render him excellent company. And I'm not alone in thinking the same applies to you. And didn't John Betjeman say he thought you were a genius?
As fond as I am of Betjeman, he must have had bats in the belfry the day he said that. I don't command respect because of my great knowledge. I engender admiration because of my great fame. Once, I happened to be on the same tube carriage as T.S. Eliot. I was both embarrassed and shocked when not a single soul on the train but I recognised him. And yet everybody recognised me, with the possible exception of T.S. Eliot. What is the world coming to when the only person who can identify a Nobel Prize winner is a telephony like me?
But what's wrong with being admired and famous? I'm a Jill of all trades and mistress of none. Perfectly content to be so. One day I could be riding camels under the African sun, the next discussing the benefits of wearing trousers with Catherine Hepburn. I never want anything that I say or write to depress anyone. Even my crime novels stubbornly refuse to manifest much malevolence. I've actually been refused membership of the Detection Club because my crime novels are deemed to be too frivolous and funny.
Well, what do you expect when your books feature a lunatic cast of characters with names like Gregory Pratoff, Mr. Polygon, Charity Puke, Mrs. Buttock and Mrs. Frightful?
What's wrong with them? Mind you, my publishers are absolutely convinced they're real people and that I'm going to be sued for libel. I don't believe you can take any fictional crime seriously, certainly not the types of criminal acts that appear in my books.
Well, I suppose you do have a point. After all, what is crime but bad manners carried to the extreme?
Oh, you have to look death in the eye and laugh at it. Although even I couldn't find anything to laugh about when I was on driver duty at the Tyneside Quay during the war. Once I was told to take my lorry and collect the bags of meat. So, when I got there, I asked for its destination and was told the mortuary. My cargo turned out to be half-frozen sacks which contained the unidentified remains of the crew of a trawler which had been blown up by a mine. At the mortuary, an old woman whose job it was to lay out corpses helped me unload the sacks, and when we'd finished I was violently sick. And I was certainly never given that duty again. Given the precarious state of your health, I think you need have no fear of that wish not being granted.
I'm full of fears. I never wanted to be successful, never tried to be. But now I have it, I'm terrified of losing it. I don't know why. It doesn't make me feel happy or fulfilled. Nothing gives me any sense of achievement. When we were still living at the workhouse, in the corner of the garden, there was a sandpit which I turned over to my own private domain. There I could be a pirate, or an Arctic explorer, or a general leading his troops to victory. There I never felt failure, or disappointment, or disapproval. I cannot say that since I left that sandpit I have ever felt the same sense of triumph, or fulfillment, or happiness. Outside of that sandpit I was abominably behaved. I would have the most terrible temper tantrums. I would smash things, throw things, scream like a banshee. I worried the life out of my poor mother. I think that's why she always thought that television was such a silly thing to have made me famous. And she feared how it might end for me. She told a friend, "One day I know, either by drinking or through that unbridled tongue, he will throw it all away." I always wanted to tell her how sorry I was for everything. She was afraid that once I went to Cambridge, I'd mix with people above my station and waste my money and my time, and she was right. All there was to show for her years of sorrow and sacrifice was a third-class degree. When I watched her die last month, I still couldn't bring myself to say I was sorry. I just begged her not to die and leave me all alone. The last thing she said to me was, "That's right, Gilbert. You will think of yourself until the last." When I visualise her face, all I can see is a rather tired, weary woman wearing a sort of patient smile and shrugging her shoulders in a resigned way as if to say, "Well, I shall never understand you, but I suppose you know what you're doing." I wish I did know what I was doing. My time is running out. I know it. Last week I overheard a BBC producer say, "I wonder how much longer we can go on displaying this drunken homosexual like a freak at a sideshow." He was talking about me.
I fear your health is about to take a turn for the worse.
Why? Has the champagne run out?
I'm afraid it looks as though the numerous public declarations about my fervent wish to marry you may have been taken a tad too seriously in some circles.
Well, what's going on?
Well, as you know, the day before we left, I was having a drink with some chaps near the express office, and they were asking me what I was going to be doing in Jamaica, and I boasted, "If I do not marry Gilbert Harding before the voyage is out, I ought to be shot."
Yes, and so the sketch ran that story. You've made similar boasts on live radio and television numerous times. I don't recall any mention of a shotgun being brandished about, but surely this is all old news, isn't it?
Well, sadly not. It now appears that someone at the Daily Mirror is concerned for my safety if you don't make an honest woman of me.
We hear ship's captains being required to make Miss Nancy Spain your bride. Well, I think I'll go and see if the captain's got that plank ready for you to walk, shall I? Or perhaps I'll just keel-haul you myself. As your American friends would say, this is a fine howdy-do, so now what are we supposed to do?
Well, we have to reply, of course.
Well, you'll have to reply, you mean?
I know. Look, I've come prepared.
And there was I, foolishly thinking that I could escape from all this newspaper nonsense for a few weeks. If you can't get away from it on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic, then what hope is there? You know, these red-top scandal sheets will fabricate a front-page story out of the mere fumes of a rumour, especially when the fumes emanate from me.
The only fumes emanating from you are usually caused by the copious amounts of whiskey you imbibe.
That is as may be. But you know that if there's the merest sniff of a story about me, the scent is immediately picked up by a pack of hungry newshounds who want to get their teeth into my hide. They're not interested in hunting down the facts, merely perpetuating the myths that have sprung up around me. From a grain of truth can be grown a legend.
History is nothing more than legend, gossip and hearsay.
Is that from Shakespeare?
No, it's from Spain, Nancy.
Good God, now you're quoting yourself.
Given that I spend great chunks of my working life quoting, it was inevitable I might start running out of famous ones and start filling the void myself. Now look, just let me get this cable done and dusted, and then we can forget all about it. I'll be able to concentrate on sending back stories about life as lived by the governor of the West Indies in the land of sugar plantations, and how the champagne corks never stopped popping under the stars in the tropical nights.
Oh, that police news family. They're all teetotal nonconformists.
How very conformist of them. By the way, is Hugh any relation to Michael Foote? I used to write book reviews for him when he was editor of Tribune.
Yes, they're brothers actually. Oh, there are 4 brothers.
Oh, 4 feet. And I bet they avoided any mention of putting your best foot forward when they were growing up.
Well, I think Hugh might have been the best foot actually. It was great fun when we were at Cambridge.
Well, isn't that what being at Cambridge was all about for you chaps? Having
Well,
fun?
it shouldn't have been. Not after all the effort I put in to get there and how hard my mother worked to keep us. But for me, actually, it was. What I remember most about Cambridge then is how happy you could be on 3 or 4 bottles of beer.
Well, what a pity you didn't learn that lesson a bit better. Especially when you and Robin Moore embarked on that 12-hour chauffeur-driven pub crawl round Brighton last year.
There's no point in having a reputation and then not living up to it. Anyway, I blame Robin for that escapade. He was always insisting, just another little drink, dear boy.
Did his intemperate habits start at Cambridge as well?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me, but I'm sure getting that war wound made things worse. Just think what I'd be like if I'd had shrapnel embedded in my head.
Was his war wound responsible for him embracing socialism as well?
No, that probably did begin at Cambridge. There were a few of us around then, though I wouldn't actually say that I was a socialist. I was just anti-Tory. I supported the general strike in 1926. That made me so unpopular with some of my fellow students, they hatched a plot to throw me in the river.
I had no idea you'd come so close to being a martyr to the socialist cause.
Oh, it didn't take much to be a revolutionary in those days. One weekend I was planning to travel to London to see Noel Coward's new play, and the senior tutor tried to stop me.
How delightful! I must tell Noel when we get back. I know he's a pillar of the establishment, but I believe he gets a secret thrill out of ruffling a few feathers sometimes.
I find that hard to credit.
Well, you're forgetting. This is a man whose first successful play was about the relationship between a nymphomaniac socialite and her cocaine-addicted son. He also had a long, mad affair with one of the king's brothers. And how on earth the pair of them got away with strolling around the West End in drag, heaven only knows. Or possibly the Masonic Lodge of the Metropolitan Police.
I still don't think you should mention my namesake. He hasn't still forgiven me for loudly snoring my way through his last play, even though I apologised to him profusely afterwards. He said, "There's no need to be sorry, my dear fellow. I have never bored you half as much as you have bored me."
That's nothing, believe me. If he really harboured any deep-seated animosity, he wouldn't have wasted such a good jibe on you. It's him and Lord Beaverbrook I have to be careful not to mention to each other. He's never forgiven Noel for that shot in Which We Serve.
Which one?
You know, near the beginning. There's a copy of the Daily Express, floating in oily seawater, bearing the headline, "No War This Year," which, of course, was his way of saying the paper's pro-appeasement policy was all at sea.
Well, can you blame Noel? Hardly a day went by without the Express running stories sneering at the film while it was still being made, ridiculing the idea that Noel was totally unsuitable to portray a heroic sea captain and a devoted family man. And we know why. They were saying that a well-known homosexual couldn't be a war hero as well.
But it isn't well known that Noel's homosexual.
Oh, no, of course not. In the same way it's not well known that you are an old-school statist. After all, you keep that well hidden, don't you? In 99% of the public appearances, you look as if you've been dressed exclusively by the army surplus stores.
I know. Nancy Mitford calls me a rough North Country peasant on the make, an assessment I'm not inclined to argue with. Noel never misses a chance to tell me that my hair looks like it's been cut by a badly set lawnmower. And the last time I put a frock on, he declared, "That dress wouldn't fool a drunken child of 2 and a half." Right, okay. Here we go. How about this for a suitable retort? Mirror, mirror in the street, what next? You'll really have us beat. The captain's name is Frederick Inch, and though he has a splendid winch and lots of hope and yards of rope, alas, the law says he may not, however willing, tie the knot. If you did not know that before, see Merchant Shipping Act of '94.
Well, it might just be an unfortunate coincidence, but I now feel the urgent need for my asthma inhaler. And possibly some oxygen, despite all this bracing sea air. I'll see what Miss Laurie is up to as well.
Fine, but you can jolly well take this with you and get it sent off to the Mirror pronto if you want to be left in peace for the rest of this trip.
I will also politely inquire of Miss Laurie how on earth she's managed to put up with you all these years.
And you'll probably get a very short, impolite answer to that great mystery of life. It is a mystery that endures. But I knew right from the first time we met that Johnny was the one, and the miracle was that it was mutual. Before I met her, all I knew about this Miss Joan Werner Laurie was that she worked for her father's publishing company. So I'd envisaged her as an elderly spinster, grown dry in the service of the firm. Instead, what I found was a girl 4 years younger than me, very good looking with rather a long nose. She'd been married and she was living with her young son Nicky. And it seemed to be only a matter of days after that before she came to collect me and all my goods and chattels and rescued me from bed-sitting room life, from years of mismanagement and debts and unpaid rent. And more than that, Johnny and Nicky awakened my fondness for humanity, which had lain hidden for so long. It's impossible for me to take a step without consulting Johnny. And yes, she has a fierce tongue. And yes, some people do find her jolly difficult. And yes, she despises people who don't try. But she saved my life. And she is certainly the only person who has ever let me be myself. And she supports me, even when I haven't been doing my best. Including when I had a brief excursion, well, just one afternoon actually, into heterosexuality. And incredibly, found myself pregnant. Once my midriff started to loom large, we managed to keep it secret. Anyway, most of the people I knew would have thought it so unlikely that I could ever be pregnant that they'd have discounted it, even if it looked like I was. Nancy Spain, going to bed with a man and getting pregnant? Don't be absurd. They would simply have attributed my widening girth to my having too many lavish lunches at the Ivy. Johnny and I decided that little Tommy would be known as her son. It was Johnny who went to register his birth, and the name on the certificate was an amalgam of our family names, Anne Brooker Seiler. It was a very fine piece of fiction and completely illegal into the bargain. But of course, back in 1952, women could still be committed to mental institutions if they became pregnant outside of marriage. As with many aspects of my life, I have kept this one hidden in plain sight. On Woman's Hour, I declared that I live with a very nice lady publisher and her 2 sons. In my memoirs, I wrote, whether Tommy flies into a rage and kicks me in the stomach, or whether he coos like an angel and climbs all over me, I have to admit that I love him, desperately, hopelessly, devotedly, and I do. We have no intention of telling him the truth, and I don't believe that we